From the JAMA Network, this is the JAMA Medical News Podcast, discussing timely topics in clinical medicine, biomedical sciences, public health, and health policy, featured in the medical news section of JAMA.
Today, we're bringing you clinical updates from the American Diabetes Association's annual scientific sessions, which recently wrapped up in New Orleans. I'm Jennifer Abbasi for JAMA Medical News. My guest today is Dr. Rita Kalyani. Dr. Kalyani is the ADA's Chief Scientific and Medical Officer and a professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Kalyani, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you're going to share with us some of the important research on diabetes and obesity care from the conference. This year's program was packed with new research on incretin-based therapies. So let's start there. I have to say I had a really hard time narrowing down the studies we're going to talk about because there are so many interesting things happening in this space. I thought we'd begin with Retatrutide. This is an investigational triple agonist, so 3 hormones in one injection. It's a glucagon-like peptide 1, glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, and a glucagon receptor agonist. So data from 2 phase 3 studies were presented at the meeting, one in people with type 2 diabetes and the other in people with obesity. What did we learn about this novel drug?
We learned a lot about this novel drug, and as you mentioned, it is a triple hormone receptor agonist and really an exciting novel mechanism of lowering blood glucose and treating diabetes. And what we learned from the trial, the phase 3 Transcend type 2 diabetes 1 trial, adults with recent onset type 2 diabetes who were not yet at glycemic target, they had an A1C between 7 to 9.5%, despite diet and exercise alone. Over 40 weeks, we saw benefits both in glycemic control, as reflected in significant improvements in A1C, and substantial weight reduction. In those who received the medication, Retatrutide, participants experienced up to a 2% reduction in A1C and a 16.8% reduction, average loss of 36.6 pounds in body weight. To put those numbers in context, 2% is what we would consider high glycemic efficacy for this agent, and 16.8% weight loss is really in the range of one of the highest that we see in terms of reduction in body weight. So really at the very upper end of what we see currently of available therapies, both in glycemic reduction and in body weight reduction. Interestingly, Retatrutide also showed improvements across cardiovascular risk factors. And we know that people with diabetes are at higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And having this additional benefit, including in LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and blood pressure, also suggests that this agent has benefits in improving cardiovascular risk profile. And promisingly, adverse events were low, similar to those of other GLP-1 receptor agonists currently on the market, with no new reported safety concerns.
Okay, so I also was hoping to talk about this drug in the context of patients with obesity without type 2 diabetes, and that was the TRIUMPH-1 trial.
Sure. In TRIUMPH-1, participants lost an average of 70.3 pounds.
Wow.
28.3% over 80 weeks, with almost half achieving more than a 30% weight loss, which is a level on par with metabolic or bariatric surgery. So this, too, was a very exciting trial. Participants had a baseline BMI of greater than 35, so they were obese. And even in the extension study, they continued to lose weight up to 140 weeks later. And so what made this trial particularly exciting is that it was in people, as you mentioned, with obesity, and the degree of weight loss that we saw with Retatrutide was really quite high in comparison to the existing agents that we have on the market.
So who do you see this drug being for? In terms of patients with obesity, we already have good options available. So will this be for people with greater levels of obesity if it gets approved?
It's always interesting when we see new mechanisms or new drugs first in class in terms of how they will fit into the clinical algorithm. And as you might imagine, we have to wait and see, once it's introduced in terms of where it may fit in the landscape for what's currently available. But I do think that in general, as we see more and more agents enter this space, we are encroaching on the outcomes that we would otherwise see with surgical options. And it really behooves the clinician or the practitioner to think about use of these agents, perhaps early on for those who would benefit from it, such as those that were included in the trials. And really, as a community, for us to understand, again, what's the durability of these glycemic and weight loss benefits long term.
Okay. So now Retatrutide, as I mentioned, is an injection. Let's talk about an oral drug next. Orforglipron is a GLP-1 pill that in April received FDA approval for weight loss, but it's not yet approved for diabetes treatment. At last year's conference, researchers presented phase 3 safety and efficacy data for people with type 2 diabetes in the ACHIEVE-1 trial. This year, we saw the results of additional diabetes trials for this drug, including the ACHIEVE-5 trial. In that study, which was published simultaneously in JAMA, researchers investigated the benefit of adding orforglipron on top of long-acting insulin in people with inadequately controlled type 2 diabetes, and they found that it improved glycemic control. So taken together, what have all these trials of this drug shown? Should clinicians be looking forward to a new GLP-1 pill for type 2 diabetes?
What we've learned is that, particularly in the ACHIEVE-5 trial and throughout the trials that you mentioned, that these looked at both safety and efficacy of orforglipron at various doses in people with type 2 diabetes taking insulin glargine, as you mentioned, with or without other diabetes medications. And what's interesting is that it was added onto basal insulin treatment. We saw great A1C reduction up to 1.82% with the highest dose, 36 milligrams, and also high degrees of weight loss as well. Having those additional glycemic benefits, even on those who are on basal insulin treatment, is remarkable for us in clinical practice because it gives us another tool for those who are already on insulin treatment as well.
Okay. Another important set of studies presented at the meeting looked at an investigational drug called CagriSema for type 2 diabetes treatment. This injection combines semaglutide and cagrilinotide, which is an amylin analog. So first, can you tell us what is amylin and why is this an interesting approach?
Yeah, amylin is a hormone that is also released by the beta cells. It's always been a topic whether this hormone, which is endogenously co-secreted with insulin by pancreatic beta cells, could have a role therapeutically in A1C reduction. And so it's exciting to see newer therapies looking at the role of amylin in our therapeutic management. We do have one currently approved agent, pramlintide, which is a synthetic analog of human amylin that's FDA approved alongside insulin for people with type 1 or type 2. And that's to help manage after meal blood sugars. But really, this trial, which has both the GLP-1 receptor agonist and the amylin analog, is a novel combination. And there's been a lot of excitement about the idea that these two injectable agents could be combined into one.
Okay, and so what did the trials find?
So these trials, known as the Reimagine trials, found a few things. So there was the Reimagine 1 trial, which was a phase 3 randomized double-blind study looking at the efficacy of CagriSema in those who had type 2 diabetes compared to placebo. And this was given as a once-weekly injection in this trial, followed by a period without treatment to see what happened after stopping. And it was in 189 patients studied around the world. And that's important to emphasize that these series of trials really had global participant enrollment. And they showed that this fixed dose combination of CagriSema could lower blood sugar and help potentially keep blood sugars in check, what would be called diabetes remission, within that time frame where people discontinue treatment. And that's important because we often wonder, particularly with these agents that both can lower blood glucose and also lead to weight reduction, that in those who might have lowering of their A1C to levels that are no longer in the diabetes range, what we would call remission, how durable that remission is. Reimagine 2 looked at the individual components of CagriSema and looked to see, what happened in comparison to those that were not well controlled with metformin or with other agents, such as SGLT2s, which are the most commonly prescribed medications. And these participants were living with overweight or obesity. And this showed that the fixed dose, so giving them together, was more effective than the individual components in terms of weight in particular. And then Reimagine 3 looked at CagriSema in type 2 that were on insulin, so similar to the one we had just talked about. And Reimagine 3 showed that in those who were already on basal insulin, adding this fixed dose combination of CagriSema did deliver robust reductions in A1C, with an A1C reduction on average from 8.8% to 6.5%, and also weight reductions of up to 12%. And importantly, no severe hypoglycemic events also in these people on insulin. So together, these trials, the Reimagine trials, demonstrated that CagriSema, particularly in a fixed dose as opposed to the individual components, had important glucose-lowering efficacy in people with type 2 diabetes and overweight or obesity. And further, in those on basal insulin, showed significant glycemic and weight loss benefits without any severe hypoglycemic events.
Okay. Next, I'd like to talk about a medication called Mazdutide. This is a glucagon and GLP-1 receptor dual agonist that is approved for weight management in China, which has the world's largest population affected by overweight or obesity. So this trial, the GLORY 2 trial, which was presented at an oral session and published in JAMA, investigated a high dose of this injected therapy in adults in China with moderate to severe obesity, with or without diabetes. The average BMI in the trial was 34. What did we learn?
As you mentioned, the population being studied in China was particularly important for this study because many of the studies that we discussed already, while they had global representation, really having these agents studied in an Asian population where there is such a great burden of diabetes gives us insight into how generalizable some of these results may be and whether there may be nuances also in the subpopulations that are being treated in terms of the benefits that we're seeing for both glycemia and weight loss. And so what they found with use of the subcutaneous Mazdutide, which, as you mentioned, is a dual glucagon and GLP-1 receptor agonist at a dose of 9 milligrams for 60 weeks in 461 individuals living in China with overweight or obesity, and 16% of them had type 2 diabetes, that overall, those who were assigned to this higher dose, Mazdutide 9 milligrams, had a placebo-subtracted weight loss of 15.1%. And also had cardiovascular risk reduction in terms of significant reductions in systolic blood pressure, triglycerides, and non-HDL cholesterol. And in those who they looked at the subset of participants that had type 2 and obesity, and the difference in weight loss between Mazdutide and placebo was lower at 5%. And we know that some of our previous trials have suggested that in those who have type 2 diabetes, that the incretin-based therapies may not have as high a degree of weight loss benefit in this population. And so that is consistent with findings we found in other trials as well. And this was consistently observed in people with type 2 diabetes across all weight loss interventions, including bariatric surgery and GLP-1 receptor agonists, as we found in other studies. And so this trial was particularly important because not only was it in a different population, a Chinese population than the other trials that we talked about today, it was in those who had obesity with a subset that had type 2, about 16%. And overall, while the degree of weight loss was relatively high at 15.1%, we found findings that have been consistent with other trials and bariatric surgery trials as well, that the degree of weight loss was lower in that subset that had type 2 diabetes.
Okay. We've been talking a lot about type 2. There are still no incretin-based therapies approved for type 1 diabetes. At the meeting, data were presented on a phase 2 trial of an investigational dual agonist specifically developed for type 1. This agent is called ecmopatide. How did it look? And does it signal that incretin-based therapies could be on the way for patients with type 1 diabetes?
It is important to emphasize, as you mentioned, that we currently don't have incretin-based therapies approved in type 1 diabetes. And so in this trial that looked at ecmopatide, a once daily dual GLP-1 GIP receptor agonist, it looked at 111 adults with type 1 diabetes who did have overweight or obesity, a BMI greater than 27. And what they found is that ecmopatide improved blood glucose and reduced body weight. The mean age of participants was 41, and a baseline A1C was 7.5%. A1C decreased by 0.34% from baseline, and more than half of participants, 56%, achieved an A1C below 7%, which is important because we focus on individualized glucose targets, 7% being by and large the most common, although we do individualize it. And so to have 56% of participants achieve an A1C below 7% is important because that is a key goal of glycemic management. The use of ecmopatide also led to dose-dependent weight loss of approximately up to 7% and reduced insulin use by up to 15% compared with placebo. So those 2 points are also important because, as mentioned, these were individuals that had type 1 diabetes and overweight or obesity. So to have that weight loss benefit, though the numbers are not as high as what we talked about in the previous trials, a 7% weight loss is on par with the degree of weight loss, for instance, we saw in the diabetes prevention program. And so it is clinically significant. And the reduction in insulin use is also important because we know that while insulin is central to treatment and a necessity for people with type 1 diabetes, that a reduction in insulin use can also have benefits in terms of the dose, in terms of reducing glycemic variability and the risk for hypoglycemia.
So do you think in the next couple of years there will be an approved incretin-based therapy for type 1 diabetes? I know it's speculative, but
Yeah, what I would say is that as we continue to develop this evidence-based, I think, and demonstrate not only efficacy for glycemia and weight loss, but also safety, which I should mention this treatment was generally well tolerated with no reported safety concerns, and hypoglycemia is the one that we would think about. As we continue to build this evidence-based, I think we will have more and more data to support use of these agents in the future.
okay. Now, incretins, of course, weren't the only topic at the conference. I'd like to close with new data on continuous glucose monitoring in type 2 diabetes. Researchers found that it improved blood glucose levels in 82% of adults with the condition who were not on insulin. Why is this an important finding?
Continuous glucose monitors have had more evidence of benefit based on the data to date in those who are on insulin. And if you look at the trials that have been reported, you will see that the A1C lowering has been found to be greater in those who are on insulin than are not on insulin. So there's always been a question that we commonly use CGMs in people with type 2 diabetes on all sorts of treatments. The A1C reduction in those without insulin has been more mixed in terms of the findings, and it also has implications for policy and coverage. And so this trial, called the CONNECT trial, was a randomized controlled trial conducted across 22 primary care practices in the US and included 283 adults with type 2 diabetes not on insulin. Their A1C ranged anywhere between 7.1 to 14.9%. So it was a wide range. And this trial looked at the impact of CGM on A1C levels over 26 weeks. So A1C was the primary outcome. And at baseline, as mentioned, the mean A1C was 8.8%. And many of these participants were also using other treatments. So 37% were using an SGLT2, 40% were using incretin-based medications. And so this study looked at, in addition to the treatments, the pharmacological treatments that people were using, whether we could see a layered benefit, an incremental A1C benefit on top of that. And what the study found is that in these participants who were already using, by and large, other pharmacotherapy, that the use of a continuous glucose monitor did result in a substantial reduction in hyperglycemia, resulting in a 0.9% greater A1C reduction after 6 months in the CGM group compared to the routine care control group. We also found that people in the CGM arm had 5 hours per day more time in the glucose target range than those in routine care. And in terms of quality of life, also people expressed greater satisfaction with glucose monitoring and reduced stress with continuous glucose monitoring.
Now, you mentioned that this could potentially have policy and coverage implications. Do you think that these should be covered for people with type 2 diabetes who are not on insulin?
I think that trials such as the CONNECT trial can help inform evidence-based policy and coverage by demonstrating the significant clinical benefit of using these technologies, even in those who are not on insulin with type 2 diabetes. So, yes, I think that a trial such as this can have significant policy implications.
Okay. So that's all of the research I wanted to talk about, but I'd love to ask you, what are you looking forward to next year?
Next year, we'll be here before we know it. And I think that we will continue to see developments in obesity and metabolic health. We talked a lot about that today. And I think that we're going to continue to see more trials and more advances in obesity and metabolic care. In addition, looking at cardiometabolic outcomes, cardiovascular, kidney, liver health, in terms of how the treatments that we have for diabetes are also reducing these complications. In addition, new strategies for beta cell replacement and cure, in addition to prevention and treatment, cure continues to be a focus for our science. It really is where we're going in terms of the most innovative science that we have to date in fostering innovation. So, looking forward to the scientific sessions next year and really appreciate the opportunity to talk today with you about all the great advances we've had in diabetes and obesity care.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kalyani. It's been a pleasure chatting with you about this new research.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for this episode of JAMA Medical News. I'm Jennifer Abbasi. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. Thanks for listening and join us again next time.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.